stayed with Maryland State Police because it was within their jurisdiction that the truckers were camping out at that racetrack. The call also included Metropolitan Police Department, Virginia State Police, and several other police departments that were engaged in managing the convoy. We also had cross-disciplinary calls with the emergency managers, fire and rescue, the public information officers. We did those 2 times a week for the first few weeks, and then they sort of waned off as things settled in. And then we also briefed groups such as the HSEC and the CAOs as it was appropriate, and things were going to look like they were going to escalate, or sometimes it's just to let them know that things are being taken care of and their law enforcement community has this at hand. Some other things that we've been doing most recently, obviously I'm sure everyone's aware of the pop-up demonstrations and protests around the region related to the leaked opinion from the Supreme Court. We're also coordinating with the Supreme Court Police Department. They're doing daily calls now, managing things like security at the justices' homes, as well as any of the movements of the protesters around the region and how we're dealing with that because they cross so many jurisdictional lines. It's just, there's no other way to do that. And other than that, I think that's about it for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. We really appreciate that. I know many of us were incredibly concerned about how the convoy might affect lives for our constituents and just life in the region. And just to know that there was that level of coordination that COG was happy and ready to facilitate is just really great to know. And I'm sure we'll be tested on an ongoing basis, but it's nice to know that we're.
Thank you. I've made a number of presentations to member jurisdictions about our Metropolitan Planning Framework for 2030, known as Region United. I think coming up are Charles County and Rockville and I think Frederick County, or the city of Frederick, excuse me. I also want to highlight recent grants, TLC, Transportation Land Use Connections Program. The TPB awarded last month 630,000 grants to support local planning, and all of these grants are aligned with our Metropolitan Planning Framework to provide for transit access, and I refer you to the NICE article and NICE report from WTOP or our news release for more information about those grants. Also want to promote the last podcast, Thinking Regionally. This focused on the pivot, post-COVID pivot. This featured 2 of our brightest bulbs here on staff, Tim Canan and Paul Desjardins. I also want to mention in conjunction with that, the producer of this podcast, Megan Goodman, is departing from COG after 7 years, and she and her husband are going to be finding their way back to Ohio. And I think, Megan, if you change your mind, you're always welcome back here. She's done a great job. I think one of the things I really appreciated was her work in 2019, 2020 on our work communicating the housing targets. So, Megan, we have appreciated everything that you've done and wish you well. So, Chair Dorsey, happy to answer questions about anything that I've mentioned here or that Scott mentioned here or other COG or regional priorities.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bean. Are there any questions? Board shot. All right, thank you so much. And seeing none, we'll move forward with the agenda. And next, we'll consider if there are any proposed amendments to our agenda for today's meeting. Seeing none, we'll next move to consideration of the minutes from our April 13th virtual meeting. Thank you, Ms. Gross. We have a motion to approve. Is there a second? Thank you. Seconded by Mr. Allen. Any discussion? All those in favor of approving the minutes, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Are there any abstentions? Hearing none and none, the motion carries. The minutes from April 13th are approved. Next, we have items on our consent agenda, and today we have 3 resolutions on the agenda for today. They all pertain to COG's role as Secretariat for the Urban Area Security Initiative and the various responsibilities that we undertake to promote regional emergency preparedness. Specifically, they are resolutions R20, R21, and R22. 2022. And as far as content, they are to receive and expend money totaling about $10 million. That includes a number of deliverables, replacing end-of-life network equipment, securing cyber monitoring services so that we can have cybersecurity readiness, equipment for metro emergencies within the metro system, and preparation for radiological and nuclear disasters. You can find the full details on page 14 of your board packet, and whenever you're ready, I'll entertain a motion to approve.
Mr. Chairman, I would move approval, but and I know that a consent calendar is supposed to be consent with no questions, but I do have a question on it.
You know what? That is absolutely, we're flexible here. We're going to work with that. So we do have a motion to approve. Let's get a second. Seconded by Mr. Lusk, and then we'll have discussion. Ms. Gross.
Thank you. On the second resolution about Metro, I know what a wheel chalk is and I know what a wheel wedge is, but it also talks about 450 Metro bags. It doesn't say anything. I'm wondering, is that just something to carry them in, or is it additional equipment? Without going into security issues, please.
Short answer is yes, that's what it is, but Mr. Gates can amplify.
That's what it is.
That's what it is.
No, in fact, it's the bags that go on the trains that contain the equipment that they use, like wheel chocks and wedges and other things that are necessary when they're responding.
I guess it's just bureaucratic language. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much. Any other questions, discussion on the consent agenda? All right, it's been moved and seconded. We'll now move to a vote. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Are there any abstentions? The consent agenda is hereby approved. We'll now move on to item number 7, and this is really one of my favorite items that we are able to do every year, and it's to show our appreciation for our region's foster parents. Foster parents are essential in our community's continuum of care to ensuring that the youth in our region are safe and have their needs provided for. Their willingness to open up their hearts, but also their homes, to these children and to help them learn life skills, reunite with their birth families, transition to independence, along with many other responsibilities, is just beyond commendable. Words really can't capture how angelic these people are among us. So I am honored to help recognize the 2022 Foster Parents of the Year for their dedication and kindness throughout their service. Now, you can read about the Foster Parents of the Year from each jurisdiction and their nominating social worker by beginning on page 16 of the board packet. But for today's meeting, we will play a video highlighting this year's outstanding foster parents of our region.
Our friends and family say, I don't know how you can do this. How can you foster children knowing that they're going to leave? You have to be willing to love them and let them go. We hope that they leave our home in better shape. You know, then we're high-fiving each other like, yes, we are consistent. We do know what we're doing.
Even if you're considering doing this, you're already the kind of person who's willing to lean in and to help a young person and help a family. So you've already got that in your DNA.
In our long serpentine journey to be parents, foster care made the most sense to us. It has become really clear the dynamic of like him being the teddy bear parent and me being the enforcer parent.
The kids came in so polite and just had like a positive light to them. We were like, well, we saw what experiences they have been through. It's not their fault. They're want to be loved and have fun just like any other child.
With the biological family, you kind of feel a kinship to them, that you're in this together, and we cheer for them when they meet different milestones and goals.
One of the greatest things that I have learned is everybody comes from a different place, and you need to respect and honor and value that in your daily life.
I want these kids to develop and build a network of trusting people so that their life as they grow into adulthood becomes a little bit easier.
It's a rewarding experience to work with the children and know that I've impacted their lives I always hope that they remember me in the moments that we shared and that they take that with them as they grow up.
It just makes my heart sing when I think about these little guys. And I've had people say, but, oh, that's just so generous of you. No, I don't see it that way. I feel very selfish about it because I get so much out of it. I really do.
It's work, and
it's a lot of work.
It's hard. It's really, really hard, but we can't even imagine not having them, like not being part of this community overall. I like to think that the four of us as a little unit kind of helped each other love.
Okay, so we had a little bit of a video and then a radio broadcast of our Foster Parents of the Year appreciation, assuming that we don't have the technical ability to sync that up, because I'd be willing to commit to being more efficient with the rest of the meeting if you all would like to see that synced up.
Yes, I think what we had was a challenge with the web interface and playing it live. So do we have the ability to start it again from scratch?
Great.
Yep.
All right. Take two. Wow. So congratulations again to all of our 2022 Foster Parents of the Year. After the meeting, staff will share the links to the video that we just viewed, in addition to the individual links for each family that was recognized, so that you may promote those families within your jurisdiction. As many of you will recall, we traditionally host the Foster Parents of the Year for an in-person reception and recognition. In one of the many casualties to the pandemic, we're not doing that this year, but hopefully you'll find ways to honor them otherwise. We will now move to item number 8, which is an opportunity to get a report on our third quarter financial results. I'm going to turn it over to Vice Chair Kate Stewart and COG Chief Financial Officer Julie Mussog, who will brief the board on our fiscal year 2022 third quarter.
Great. Thank you very much, Chair Dorsey.
So the Q3 financial report for fiscal year 2022 is in your board packet starting on page 20, showing the results for the quarter that ended March 31st, 2022. This is an interim unaudited report prepared by management. I've reviewed the financial information. It was nice to get back in the chair as treasurer. And COG's chief financial officer will go over this in detail, and I'm going to turn it over to her right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Julie Mussog. I know that I haven't necessarily met many of you in person. It's nice to be in person again. And our next agenda item, I was saying to Chuck that it'll be the first time I've presented the board to the board in person the budget since I've been here for more than 2.5 years. So I'm looking forward to that as well. I'll start with the ending. Overall, COG remains financially healthy, and the board designated reserves are 100% funded as of the end of the third quarter. The budget for FY22 is to end the year with a small surplus of $86,000 in undesignated funds, and we're on track for that at the end of the third quarter with an undesignated surplus of $122,000 and from our $38.7 million operating budget. As of the end of Q3, we also have an increase of about $500,000 in undesignated program fund balances, which is above the budget. This surplus is primarily a timing issue where we have collected funds in advance of expenses being recognized, and most of this increase is from the Amazon grant for the Housing Affordability and Planning Program. The remainder is due to several water and air programs that have received their full funding for the year in advance of the budget spend. Operating revenues and expense are tracking lower than the budget at this point at 63%, but higher than mid-year totals for the prior year. Revenues are generally higher in the second half of the fiscal year, so it is in large part a timing issue, and we do expect to track closer to the FY22 budget by year end. Lower federal and state revenue year-to-date to the budget is driven by lower spend in Transportation Planning Board Work Program and commuter connections. These are both cost reimbursable projects, so the year-to-date expenses are also lower than budget, coming in at about 60% so far for the year. One major variance on the statement of revenue, expense, and change in net position is in subrecipient pass-through funds, which are at 33% of the amount budgeted. This will be familiar from Q2 report as well. A significant portion of the subrecipient pass-through funds budgeted for enhanced mobility have not yet been recognized, but are expected to total about $5.7 million for this year. In addition, pass-through funds for an Amtrak repower project budgeted for FY22 have not been received, but the expectation is these funds will be recognized in the next fiscal year once a vendor is selected for the project, since the funding was approved by the funding agency in late December of 2020. The statement of net position as of March 31, 2022 shows an overall increase in net position of $2 million. This increase reflects the impact of the increase year over year in the restricted fund balance and undesignated funds from FY21. And like I said, overall COG remains financially healthy, and the board designated reserves are 100%. So I'm happy to try and answer any questions at this point.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes, Ms. Briskman.
Thank you, Chair. Forgive me for not remembering, but did we fund the Farm Committee in 22?
Yes, the Farm Committee is being paid with some of the surplus undesignated funds that we had at the end of fiscal 21. Fiscal 2023, it'll be funded by the regional fee that was approved last fall by the board.
Okay, great. I was just thinking if we had some fund balance, we might put it toward that if it hadn't been funded. But thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Julie.
Okay. If there's no other questions, since there's no further board action required, I'll turn things back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mussog. And we'll move now to item number 9, which is looking at our fiscal 23 work program and associated budget. And I'll turn to Mr. Bean and Ms. Mussog again, who will brief the board on both of these items. Following their presentation, we do have an action item, and you'll be asked to consider Resolution R23, 2022, the text of which is on page 32 of your board packet that has been reviewed and recommended by the Budget and Finance Committee. So, Mr. Bean.
Thank you. As we bring up the PowerPoint, just a reminder that there is some information in your board packet. I think the memo to the board, which is the summary, is on page 25. And in the board packet, there's a link to the full 70-some page work program and budget. This is my 10th budget presented to the board, and this is the most solid budget yet. The guiding principles, we're looking for a balanced budget. As an executive director, looking right towards the operations, revenue, and expenses page. This is page 5 of that separate document, the work program and budget, and there's that is positive 49,000. So just in the black, and that line item means for me a balanced budget. Looking to leverage the general funds for programs focused on COG's mission and priorities such as the Region United Metropolitan Washington Planning Framework for 2030. And on transportation, public health, housing, public safety, cost-effective environmental protection, and value for members such as the Cooperative Purchasing Program. Internally, we're looking for promoting a work environment that attracts top talent to ensure members and stakeholders have a great supporting staff team for the many disciplines and support to the region. I'm going to ask our CFO to bring us through some of the details in the following slides.
Thank you. The proposed FY23 budget is $54.2 million. This is $4.9 million, or approximately 10% higher than the current FY22 budget. Higher revenues are primarily because of some transportation-related work programs, the new regional fund for the farm program, and additional pass-through funds for the Urban Area Security Initiative, otherwise known as UASI, which you'll hear about several more times. The FY23 budget, as previewed by the Budget and Finance Committee and proposed here, reflects prior year restricted fund balance use of about $400,000. This is related to the regional housing analysis, some air quality, and public safety programs. And then there's a small surplus, around $50,000, that has not been specifically identified for use in some environmental programs, but the expectation is that this picture will become clearer as the year progresses, and the overall general fund program budget will be neutral. Page 5 of the work program has more detail on this. The complete FY23 work program and budget is a 74-page document, and a link is included under publications on the May 11, 2022 COG Board of Directors webpage. This slide details revenues by program area. Transportation planning is 36% of the total COG budget, or approximately $19.3 million in operating revenue. The bulk of this is the core Metropolitan Planning Organization work budget that has already been approved by the TPB, or Transportation Planning Board. Transportation operations is funding for the commuter connections and some pass-through funding. Funding for enhanced mobility grants is greater in even years. Thus, transportation operations accounts for 27% of the budget versus 32% last year. In total, transportation programs represent 63% of COG's budget. Water, environmental resources, and air quality together total $10 million, or about 19% of the total COG budget, of which $2.7 million is pass-through related to the Amtrak engine repower project that I was just speaking to in the third quarter review. Homeland security and public safety is about 14% of the total COG revenue and is $7.6 million. This includes pass-through and operating funds, and the pass-through funds are primarily related to UASI. Community planning and services, strategic initiatives, and member services make up the remaining 4% of the budget and represent core work supporting to the MPO and long-range forecasts and strategic initiatives like housing and health planning. Slide 6 details the sources of the $54.2 million in revenue. As in prior years, the largest single source is the federal government at 63%. This funds the MPO, transportation operations, including enhanced mobility, pass-through grants, and some FEMA and UASI pass-through. The second largest funding source at 14% is state and district revenue, and this revenue is used primarily to fund commuter connections, the transportation match for the core MPO work, and environmental work. The third largest at 9% is member dues. Most of these funds are used as a match to leverage federal and state and other regional project funds and is the primary support for our work in housing and health.
Thank you. Just picking up on some of the priorities within this budget, Region United planning framework, bringing together our focus on equity, on high-capacity transit station areas, on housing targets, and our goals on climate change. COG turned 65, and I would venture that this is the most integrated, from a comprehensive planning approach, less siloed, most integrated approach that we've undertaken under the banner of Region United. We had a meeting of the health officers here on Monday, first in-person meeting in 2 years of that group. One remarked that he's been advocating a health in all policies approach, which would be familiar to many of you, and he's evolving towards an equity in all policies approach. I think our focus on equity emphasis areas throughout all our disciplines might be characterized with that phrase, and you'll hear more about that in the last item of the board meeting today. The other is taking advantage of a once-in-a-generation infusion of federal funding in infrastructure. So we'll talk about that in more detail. Next slide. All right. Seem to have a shade on the screen, but hopefully board members can see that, and this slide deck is part of the board packet too. We'll continue our partnership with TPB to finalize the region's update to the Long-Range Transportation Plan, Visualize 2045. As part of this effort, staff will conduct outreach to help member jurisdictions advance their aspirational initiatives, which focuses on housing as it relates to transportation and climate change as it relates to transportation. Also focus on housing. A couple of notable activities is a regional study to be submitted to HUD on the impediments to fair housing in this region. Many of your member jurisdictions are part of this study. And on homelessness, we're looking at the inequities in the region with services for homelessness. That's our racial equity audit of homeless services in the region. And at next month's board meeting, we'll be coming to the board for approval of grants for our new housing affordability planning program. In Homeland Security and Public Safety, staff led by Mr. Boggs worked to regionally refine and implement a mutual aid agreement through the Mutual Aid Operations Plan, Fire and Rescue Plans, and Emergency Management Plans. As Mr. Boggs noted, we've begun to work more directly with federal officials who are seeking improvement in the manner in which federal law enforcement agencies interact with local law enforcement agencies, particularly during no-notice events. The goal is to develop a more seamless approach to federal-local interaction and to clear impediments to support. The events of June 2020 and then January 2021 highlight the need for continued work on this kind of collaboration. Staff will also work with our Homeland Security Executive Committee and CAO committees to ensure and refine strategic security priorities such as cybersecurity and to create alignment between our strategic direction and funding of project priorities. In environmental initiatives, notably, COG staff will continue to work with jurisdictions to create best practices for stream restoration, consider options for regionally reducing coastal and overland flooding. We continue to be engaged in regional efforts, including collaboration with utilities to address needed diversification of the region's water supply. We'll also be actively working on implementing the 2030 Climate and Energy Action Plan to help us realize the greenhouse gas reductions we adopted in 2020. Many of you are working on this, and the President has made this a major focus of the federal government. And under food security, COG staff will continue to work with the Farm Policy Committee and affiliated work groups to identify regional opportunities to reduce food insecurity and to support agricultural efforts that increase the region's food security and resilience. COG staff at the direction of the Farm Committee is engaged with federal, state, and local partners to support the continuation of critical food-related benefits which help to mitigate ongoing food insecurity concerns. COG is also working collaboratively with regional jurisdictions and nonprofit agencies to identify and address challenges in the region's food supply chain related to data, information sharing, preparedness, capacity, equity, and opportunity. And just to pick up on Supervisor Briskman's earlier question, when we created the regional fee, local jurisdictions were asked to provide amounts $15,000, $25,000, $35,000, and that provided a base, a sustainable base. And when that kind of thing happens, it creates other opportunities. So We now have a $1 million grant that will be focused on food supply chain for the region. And I'm not sure that would have happened without the leadership that you all demonstrated in creating that new program. So more on that in the months to come. And I think we're going to go back a little bit more to the numbers, and with that, our CFO.
So slide 9 has some budget highlights. Just as a reminder, member dues rate increased 2 cents from the FY22 rate, which was ratified by the board in October of 2021. Operating revenue increased $2.4 million, or approximately 6% over the fiscal 2022 work program. This is driven by additional funding for existing programs rather than new programs, and TPB accounts for about half of that total increase of $2.4 million. Subrecipient pass-through increased by about $2.5 million, or 24% over FY22, and most of this is due to budgeting for $4 million in UASI projects. That is partially offset by the reduced enhanced mobility grants, which are on a biannual basis. And the reserves are also fully funded at policy levels in this budget. So a little more detail on the board-designated reserves. In fiscal 23, we expect to maintain the operating reserve at the projected FY22 year-end balance of $5.2 million. This is reflective of a balanced budget for fiscal 23 with zero use of operating reserves. The reserve will remain funded at 100% of the policy level. Based on COG's current 5-year capital plan, the capital reserve is forecasted to be funded at $4.7 million as of the end of fiscal 23 and is 100% funded per policy. As a reminder, the capital expenditure plan is a 5-year rolling plan, with the next iteration coming to the board for approval in September. Bottom line, we are good on reserves. We have adequate funding for any economic uncertainty, and although not a part of the operating budget beyond the expense that we budget for it in fringe, we are in solid ground with our pension at a 109% funded ratio on an actuarial basis and 124% funded ratio on a market basis as of 12/31/21.
So wrapping up, Mr. Chairman, regarding the timetable, as a routine, the Budget and Finance Committee comes to the board in October regarding member dues for the forthcoming year. We do so that early in order for city and county managers to incorporate those dues assumptions into their budgets, and we will monitor finances and needs and plans accordingly and come to the Budget and Finance Committee and then the board in October about future dues. And throughout the year, I keep the Executive Committee apprised of trends. They, along with the Budget and Finance Committee, met in April. The Budget and Finance Committee includes all of the Executive Committee, the corporate officers, and the chairs of TPB and MWEC. And we did about a 3 times more detailed presentation with that Budget and Finance Committee, and they're bringing their recommendation to the board for your consideration today. So with that, CFO Masag and I are happy to answer questions. If not, I'll turn it back to the chairman for consideration of Resolution 23.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bean and Ms. Masag. Let's get some questions before we put a motion out there on the floor. Ms. Gross.
Thank you. On the pie chart, the tiniest sliver, 1%, is building and interest revenue. And decades ago, COG did a very smart thing by building and owning this building. But I'm wondering, because things have changed considerably over the last several years, how does that 1% compare to previous years, and what are our future expectations, especially since we no longer, I think we're probably don't have the kind of rental income for the building that we had anticipated years ago.
Thank you. Julie, why don't you pick up on the first part of the question on the proportionality compared to the past, and then Mr. Gates, if you could pick up on some of our thinking on use of space.
So that it's very comparable to years past at 1%. That's primarily driven by the REIT dividend that we receive based on the rents in the building. Fortunately, the leases in the building are through 2026, and we do own the building with our 2 other partners, and their obligation is to pay that rent. So I don't suspect that there'll be any problems, although there are substantial portions of the building available for sublet right now. The tenants that have those leases are responsible for making those payments through
whether they're here or not.
Right.
Okay.
Correct.
Another smart move.
And thank you, Ms. Gross. I'll quickly comment on what we envision for the building, at least in the near term. Obviously, the office market is in flux as we all try and figure out what the market looks like post-pandemic. So our position has been to be very cautious and to move slowly with respect to any kind of decision-making concerning the building. As the CFO points out, our rental income is stable, our partners are stable. We do have some retail space in the facility that we had been trying to market prior to the pandemic. That, of course, has been a challenge, but it's a very small portion of the space. And we have forestalled most of our internal renovation work or plans, just quite frankly not knowing exactly how we should proceed with those at this time and not wanting to make the investment. Our space continues to be very functional. We maintain the space and remedy issues that occur within the space as is needed to do. But we do not have any immediate plans to change our current construct, whether from either from an ownership or from an internal use of the space perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I asked the question because I think we need to remember that we're not only doing a lot of regional work, but we've got some bricks and mortar that
Absolutely.
we're responsible for,
Indeed.
and which is unlike some other organizations we belong to. So I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
And I appreciate that line of questioning just to refresh everyone, but also as an introduction to some newer faces at the board table. So thank you, Ms. Gross. Any other questions? Seeing none, I'd love to entertain a motion for adoption of Resolution R23-2022. Thank you. It's been moved by Ms. Briskman. It's been seconded by Mr. Lusk. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And any abstentions? All right. The budget and work plan for FY23 is now approved. Thank you. And I would like to note that we did not anticipate Mr. Lusk, our Secretary-Treasurer, to be here today, so we enlisted Vice Chair Stewart to step in and introduce and frame that, but you're here, which means you got to freeload. And
I was able to change my schedule, and thank you very much, Mayor Stewart. You did an exceptional job.
Well, it's always great to have you here, and I'm glad you were able to change your plans. Thank you so much for your work as Secretary-Treasurer. We do appreciate it greatly.
Let you know that I've been on.
And Ms. Partman, I forgot that we were doing this hybrid thing. Hopefully we did not overlook any questions from members who are participating virtually. All right, thank you. I will do better next time, our virtual participants, to make sure I do that before we move into the votes. Thank you, Supervisor Bailey, for that thumbs up. Appreciate it. Okay, we're now going to move on to item number 10, which is the regional homeless enumeration. So we are going to be briefed on the annual point-in-time count, which was conducted for the 22nd year in a row earlier this winter of persons experiencing homelessness in our region. And this activity is conducted by our Homeless Services Committee. You can view the executive summary on page 33 of the board packet, which also links to the full report, which is available on the COG website. So we are going to hear today from the co-chairs of the committee, Community Partnership for the Prevention of Homelessness Senior Analyst Elizabeth Young, and Fairfax County Office to Prevent and End Homelessness Director Tom Barnett. I will turn it over to Ms. Young to get us started. Thank you so much for joining us.
Chair Dorsey.
Okay, we're going to switch then. Mr. Barnett, I guess, is going to start. See, I'm quick.
Chair Dorsey and members of the COG board, my name is Tom Barnett, and together with my co-chair, Elizabeth Young, on behalf of COG's Homeless Services Committee, thank you for the opportunity to present the results of the 22nd annual point-in-time count of people experiencing homelessness in the Metropolitan Washington region. This year's enumeration was conducted on January 26th of this year. I also want to thank the 9 participating jurisdictions for the cooperation and support in providing the data for today's presentation and the COG staff. The 2022 point-in-time enumeration was the one-day annual snapshot of the number of people sheltered and unsheltered people experiencing homelessness in the region. The count includes literally homeless single adults, families with children, and unaccompanied youth, all living in shelters, transitional housing, on the streets, parks, and campsites, and the formerly homeless living in permanent supportive housing, those who were rapidly rehoused, and those living in other forms of permanent housing. The count does not include persons who are at risk of becoming homeless due to evictions, or those living doubled or even tripled up in housing. During a typical winter, the local jurisdictions increase their shelter capacity to encourage people who might otherwise sleep on the street to go into local shelters in order to prevent the loss of life. This was not a typical winter, but for the second time, the count was conducted with health and safety precautions as a primary concern. Local continua of care, COCs, followed the CDC and local health department guidance to protect people experiencing homelessness, unsheltered homelessness specifically, as well as the outreach workers and experienced survey volunteers from the risk of exposure to COVID-19. The primary means for which the count is conducted is electronically using the Homeless Management Information System, as 87% of people experiencing homelessness in 2022 were in some form of shelter. However, the COCs in this region are among the minority nationwide, as they have conducted unsheltered counts annually since the declaration of the pandemic in 2020 to better understand the impact of COVID-19 on our neighbors sleeping in places not meant for human habitation. On slide 2, this is how many people are experiencing homelessness in our region. The following table is a comparison of the count of people experiencing literal homelessness by jurisdiction for 2021 and 2022. In 2022, 7,605 persons were counted compared to 8,309 in 2021. This is the lowest number ever recorded since the region began collaborating on the count in 2001, and the fourth year in a row that the total number of persons counted was below 10,000. This represents an 8% decrease compared to last year. In general, this year's decrease is attributable to the District of Columbia's reduction in the number of persons experiencing homelessness by 701 people in 2022 compared to 2021. On slide 3, significant decline in families experiencing homelessness. The household composition table is a breakdown in the number of single adults or households without children, families, the number of persons in households with adults and children, and the number of households with only minor children from 2018 to 2022. Since 2018, the region had a 50% decrease in the total number of persons and families and a 9% increase in single adults. For 2022, the region had the 5th consecutive year of decline in the number of persons in homeless families. Children also represented 60% of the persons who were in homeless families in the 2022 count. It is important to note, however, that area public schools track the number of children experiencing homelessness on a cumulative basis throughout the school year, compared to the one-day snapshot of the point-in-time count. This self-reported information is based upon definitions provided by the U.S. Department of Education, and these children may or may not be in area homeless shelters and may be living in doubled-up situations. Based upon guidance from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, local jurisdictions cannot count people who live in doubled-up situations. Declining chronic homelessness. This slide represents single adults in the metropolitan Washington region who reported meeting HUD's definition for chronic homelessness on the night of the count. Note that in 2022, 47 families were counted as chronically homeless. No unaccompanied youth were counted as chronically homeless. A person who is chronically homeless, per the HUD definition, has a disabling condition and has either been continuously homeless for a year or more, or who has had 4 episodes of homelessness in the last 3 years, where the episodes of homelessness must cumulatively equal at least 12 months. Since 2018, the incidence of chronic homelessness has decreased by 16%. And this is attributed to a variety of factors. Strategies such as the use of a housing-first approach, by-name lists to prioritize chronically homeless persons is being used throughout the region, has been proven effective in reducing chronic homelessness nationwide. Access to permanent, deeply affordable housing will also make a difference in ensuring the region is able to make sustained progress in ensuring homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring. And now I'm going to turn to my co-chair, Elizabeth Young, to share the rest of the key findings.
Thanks, Tom. Okay. In addition to population totals, the region's COCs also track demographic data on the people who touch our systems to better understand disparate impacts and to address gaps in our regional homelessness response. In this slide, we're looking at the race of all adults counted in this year's point-in-time count compared to the region's population as a whole. Both single adults and adults in families are more likely to report their racial identity is Black or African American. 73% of adults experiencing homelessness responded that they identify as Black, whereas only 25% of the region's population identify as Black or African American. It's important to note that a legacy of institutional and systemic racism is the root cause of the disproportionate representation of people of color, and that continues to impact our communities today. The 9 participating jurisdictions in COG's Homeless Services Committee recognize this racial disparity, and so in June of last year, we began a collaboration with the consulting firm C4 Innovations, a nationwide leader in addressing racial inequities in homelessness. Together with C4, we are examining our homeless services systems both at the local level and regionally to find opportunities to better align our strategies with the goal of creating a more racially equitable approach to ending homelessness. We look forward to sharing the results of that collaboration with you later this year. Now looking at veteran homelessness, since 2018, the region has reduced the number of homeless veterans by 40%. This overall reduction in the count of veterans experiencing homelessness can be attributed to targeted funding from the federal government to assist veterans in the form of 2 different types of permanent housing vouchers, the Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing, or VASH vouchers, and Supportive Services for Veterans Families, or SSVF vouchers. It's important to note that since 2018, not only has there been a reduction at the regional level, but all 9 COCs have reduced their numbers of veterans experiencing homelessness during that time. Though we've seen a sizable reduction in the past 5 years, it is noted that this year's count compared to 2021 is relatively flat. The difference was a decrease of just 4 persons across the region. So while we celebrate this regional achievement, we know that we are constrained in our ability to reduce numbers further without additional permanent housing resources. Permanent housing is the ultimate solution to ending homelessness. To emphasize that point, I'm going to say it again. Permanent housing is the ultimate solution to ending homelessness. This includes both unsubsidized housing and subsidized housing, like permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing programs. As this chart shows, regional progress continues to be made by reconnecting persons who experience homelessness to some form of permanent housing. The bar chart here highlights the increase in the overall number of formerly homeless individuals and families who have been placed in a permanent supportive housing, were rapid rehoused, or living in some other type of permanent housing compared to the count of people experiencing homelessness since 2018. So the blue bars here are those who are in permanent housing, and the orange bars are our point-in-time counts of literally homeless individuals and families by year. In 2022, there was an 11% increase in permanent housing placements compared to 2018. The significant number of people placed in some form of permanent housing has constrained the incidence of homelessness in the region and has helped prevent it from growing unchecked since 2018. This housing strategy reinforces the need to provide more affordable housing resources, not just to households experiencing homelessness, but also low-income households in the region. This is crucial to prevent people from experiencing homelessness or to move those folks who weren't able to prevent a loss of their housing into some form of permanent housing as quickly as possible. In addition, we know that good paying employment is key to maintaining housing, and as the the economy recovers, we need to provide robust workforce development programs to assist low-wage and low-skilled workers to secure better-paying jobs in order to afford the high cost of housing in this region. So, some conclusions and recommendations for you. The context in which the homeless services systems are now operating are dramatically different than they were 2 years ago. However, we've learned a lot over that time from coordinated local, state, and federal actions to prevent homelessness and to keep people safe and healthy from the pandemic. We should celebrate the hard work of the region's 9 COCs, the work that we've done to reach this milestone, and continue to make steady progress to ensuring that the experience of homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring. COG's Homeless Services Committee members would like to underscore the importance that homelessness prevention and diversion programs, coupled with tenant protections through eviction moratoria, has had on reducing the flow of people entering the homeless services system region-wide. We therefore recommend strengthening these programs going forward to continue progress in ensuring we find alternatives to homelessness for people experiencing a housing crisis. Emergency rental assistance and targeted housing vouchers that were funded by multiple sources have allowed the region's COCs to move people into permanent housing during this time. But as federal emergency funding for these resources are becoming exhausted, it's critical that our local governments, region-wide, sustain and increase these investments to be able to make continued progress in reducing the number of individuals and families experiencing homelessness. COG's Homeless Services Committee further recommends that our response must be centered on racial equity. As I mentioned earlier, people of color are disproportionately represented in the homeless services system, as well as in COVID-19 infections and deaths. Ensuring that our efforts do not compound existing inequities is crucial as we think about our work in the year ahead. A key component in being able to work together effectively as a region is being able to share data. One of the priority areas that COG's Homeless Services Committee outlined in our Regional Compact to End Homelessness, which was adopted early in 2021, is the creation of a regional data sharing agreement. Now, there's still much work to be done to facilitate that ability for COCs to work across the region successfully to resolve a person's experience of homelessness, but we are committed to that work. Lastly, I'd like to reiterate that housing is healthcare. Access to permanent housing as a solution cannot be emphasized enough. While we are in a much different place today than we were, this time last year, definitely 2 years ago, with regard to COVID-19, during a pandemic without a home, it is especially challenging to stay healthy and safe. In closing, on behalf of myself, my co-chair Tom, and the entire COG Homeless Services Committee, thank you for the opportunity to present the results from this year's point-in-time count. I'd like to please note for you all that at the end of the report, there are summaries from each of the 9 participating jurisdictions where you can find a little more detail about their individual point-in-time counts, local homeless services, as well as accomplishments from the past year. We would be happy to answer any questions that you have now. Thank you, Chairman Dorsey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burnett and Ms. Young, and I'll also acknowledge the report's author and our housing program manager, Hillary Chapman, who is also here to address any questions and conversation that are surfaced by board members. And so at this point, I'd like to first recognize any comments from board members in the room. We'll start with Mr. Allen, and then Mr. Lusk, and then I promise to remember to get to those who are joining virtually. Mr. Allen.
Thank you. Thank you both really much for the presentation. Obviously, with my DC hat on, I am proud to see that DC has a 14% reduction over last year and is helping drive that. On the other hand, 4,400 individuals experiencing homelessness is unacceptable, and so it really highlights how much more work we've got to do. A couple of things jumped out at me. The theme I'm just kind of thinking about is the coordination. So from the from the city's perspective, from the district, we've worked hard to create legal counsel for individuals facing eviction to help stop evictions from happening in the first place. We've used tools like our evictions moratorium, which absolutely we know help keep people in housing. And then we know we've dramatically increased our permanent supportive housing vouchers, both through council action in last year's budget by asking our wealthiest households to chip in just a little bit more, but also in the budget that was put forward by the mayor this year, preserved those increases and actually went on top of that. So I think we are, to your point about making sure we have more vouchers, we are just in the last year. We're making significant improvement, which is great. The coordination, I was curious to get your thoughts, Ms. Young, and anybody else on. We're a block away from Union Station. We have seen, as the National Park Service decides to close some parks, but with a lack of coordination with the district or with others, simply just moves and displaces individuals to another public space. And we know that our best success is when we have that high-intensity outreach to help do the assessments and then help get people into housing. Just want to give you a chance to share anything you want to around, as we go through the process, which is I think about 3 weeks or so away from both Columbus Circle and I believe it's 11th and F Northwest, so 2 prominent NPS sites where we have large encampments. How are you feeling about the coordination that's taking place to make sure those individuals are hopefully able to successfully move into permanent supportive housing using those vouchers and those tools that we're trying to create? That coordination is just so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think spot on. The coordination is absolutely important and critical to make sure that, folks can be connected to the resources that are available to them, actually, as swiftly as possible and without, too much trauma along the way of that, that action. As far as how hopeful I feel about it, that's kind of a hard question to answer. I do know that we have pretty great coordination with our CSON outreach teams. I'm going to botch what that stands for, but they are a combination of various outreach teams throughout the district that do have designated areas and are working, daily with folks to get them connected to permanent housing. So, I think that, just really bolstering that work and ensuring that we can make sure that our outreach teams are there on site when these things are happening to prevent, or to help facilitate the moves and to help provide alternatives is critical. So yeah, it's challenging, of course, right? This is a challenging issue, and we've seen just on this issue of unsheltered homelessness in the district, I'm pleased to share that we had a reduction, right, overall. But when you look at the number of unsheltered individuals, it's been flat. I think it increased by around 10 people this year. For the past few years, it's just stubbornly been sticking there, and so I think there is an opportunity to be very creative about how we're approaching this, and I know we're doing some of that work now, but it's definitely an issue that needs attention for sure. I hope that answers your question. Absolutely.
I will, like you, I'm going to remain hopeful but cautious about that coordination. Yeah. And Mr. Chairman, I'm proud of some of what we can show from the district standpoint, but again, it's not lost on me the sheer magnitude and knowing how much more. And I think the solutions that have led to some of the district's success have shown that there's not a single policy solution. It is these different tools that we're trying to put together, marrying putting our money forward, and so putting into the budget, putting our policies together, using our courts, using our advocates, using our community-based organizations, our housing providers all together, and we still have a long way to go. But I'm proud of what we've been able to accomplish this last year.
If I can just highlight one thing just for the district's sake, the coordination of the different prevention measures that were put in place, both our locally funded homeless prevention program and our locally funded ERAP, as well as the federal resources that were administered through the state EC program. In fiscal year 21, it prevented 23,000 households from losing their housing or having interruption there. And so I think that number is really critical to think about when we think about, how we can prevent more folks from coming into our system, and definitely keep driving that number down as we go. Absolutely. Through the years.
Yeah, both sides of that coin are so important. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, of course. And we do applaud the district's success. And even though it takes a lot, none of it happens without the resources, which the district has definitely stepped up on in recent years. So thank you. Mr. Lusk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll say when I heard the decrease in the number of folks who are homeless in D.C., I was impressed by it. So I'm going to say I heard it, and it left an impression. So
Mr. Lusk, I want to make sure your microphone is on.
It is. The light's on.
There you go.
Can you hear me better?
Thank you.
I'll move closer. So 2 quick things. Looking at the City of Alexandria, it notes that its percentage reduction was 47% over 2018 through 22. Just curious, were those folks placed in either temporary temporary or permanent supportive housing? What was the outcome with that reduction?
Good afternoon, Supervisor Lusk. We don't actually have data on the outcomes of anyone who was counted on this night, because the information that's in this report is de-identified. So it's the COG staff and the COCs only look at aggregate numbers that were, so can't say that persons in any one particular jurisdiction what their ultimate outcome was, but certainly I would just note that for smaller jurisdictions, when you're looking at percent reductions, it typically is because, not to diminish by any means the accomplishments of the City of Alexandria or some of our smaller cities and counties, but that we're looking at a smaller numerator. So that percent reduction is, that's what we usually try to present the numbers in both total numbers as well as percent terms.
Can I ask a follow-up on that?
Sure, please.
Just out of curiosity, I mean, to me, it seems like it would be helpful to have some sense of what's happened with the folks that we had in a previous point in time survey. Is there any way to, I don't know, can we anomalize it, or if we can figure a way that we can capture information and know what's been the outcome? I mean, to me, it's like a measurement without an outcome doesn't really tell you very much. And if Mr.
Lusk, if it's okay, because I can sense a little discomfort with our panelists in speaking to this, because I think on some level, part of this requires each jurisdiction to figure out whether or not it's going to collect and share disaggregated data, which is something that, I'll just say that our jurisdiction of Arlington County is moving towards that so that we can better ask the questions of how are we helping, who are we helping, and how do we know why? But without a jurisdiction's commitment to being able to collect, analyze, and disseminate that disaggregated data, what you desire is probably not possible, but I'll let our panelists speak.
I'll just start by saying there are different ways to measure outcomes. Point in time is not necessarily, point in time is just one. Yeah. It is not even necessarily the best. Right. And with that, I'm going to tip it to my co-chairs to talk about, I think they can talk a little more succinctly about some of the other ways in which they are measuring outcomes. It is an important question. I can't point to a single individual in this report, but certainly there is information on outcomes, and those are being measured not just for the local COCs, but also by HUD. So I'm going to toss it to Tom and Elizabeth.
Supervisor Lusk, some of the most common ways of measuring outcomes for people in permanent housing is obviously whether they retain housing, or whether when they leave that permanent housing, are they exiting to other housing destinations. As we were kind of thinking about an answer, data sharing is very important. The Commonwealth of Virginia is progressing a homeless data integration project, or HDIP, which we hope will dovetail with the existing data sharing agreements that are already in place among DC and a couple of Maryland jurisdictions. So we're heading in the right direction in terms of what this board committed to with the regional compact, and I hope that housing outcomes will be part of that story as we have more data.
Okay, that's helpful.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move to Ms. Briskman, and then can I get a sense of, I'm sorry, you're trying to get a third in? Well, I tell you what, because we're short in time, hold it and we'll come back to you.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Briskman.
Thank you, Chair Dorsey. I'm glad to see that racial equity will center our response on this because it looks as if we have proven if we target certain communities, then we can reduce homelessness. If we did it for the veteran community at 40%, then we certainly can do it for other particular categories, I would think. Two questions. Do you think the ARPA and CARES Act rental assistance and other programs have led to some of this reduction? And by the way, I'm disappointed to see Loudoun County's up 24%, but we had a small piece of the pie anyway. But and should we not prepare ourselves for our numbers, because I'm hearing that the money's running out, and so maybe we should prepare ourselves for the fact that these numbers aren't going to look so great next year. So that's my first question. And my second question is, I heard some terminology of unsheltered, and then the schools are giving you information about folks that may be, what I'm interpreting is giving you information about folks that may be couch surfing. So that's my concern. I don't think we captured here the number of people that might, especially teenagers, that are couch surfing. So they're technically homeless, but they're sheltered. And I know that's a difficult number to get at. I have a feeling that you guys didn't and weren't able to, and I just wanted you to speak to that if you could. Thank you.
And if we could, I'm sorry to do this to you, but concise responses if we can. Thank you.
I can start with that last question about the schools data and whether or not unstably housed individuals and youth are included. So the short answer is no. This is the literally homeless count, and that is just because it is a HUD requirement, and this is the sort of HUD literally homeless definition. So we wouldn't include anyone who would be couch surfing or doubled up, that sort of thing. And to your point, that is a way a lot of young people do experience homelessness before getting into that shelter door. I would just add that in individual continuums of care, we do this in the district, and I know other continuums do as well, do complete like youth counts during the year, sometimes in alongside their point in time count. The district, we do ours in September, and at least the district's count does include unstably housed youth in that figure. So there are kind of some different places that you can look for that information. With regard to the school data, so we don't receive any data from any education data from school. I think typically individual school districts will do their own reporting on that every year, so that might be something to look for with that data, but it's not aggregated with this in any sort of way.
I'll just add in real quick, concisely about the CARES Act and ARPA money. Certainly it is a concern. I think that's the short answer. The eviction moratorium's ending. The federal dollars dedicated to homelessness, all within the next year, coming to an end. We will anticipate some sort of result. We just don't know what yet.
Okay, thank you. And do we have any comments from participants on the WebEx?
Yes.
Okay, Ms. Perry.
Well, I'm concerned about the report with the 14% decline, only 701 persons, because what it doesn't take into account is the number of people that were rehoused. I think that net decline shows, 14% looks good, but 700 persons is not anywhere close. We rehoused more than 3 times that. I'm certain. I know that. So I'm just concerned that is this number based on the point in time count, or what is this number?
The short answer to that is yes, Ms. Perry.
It's only at the night of the point in time.
Yes.
Okay. And I think we need to, and I think someone discussed this a little bit earlier, that we need to show more data, because the problem, and not because we need, the pat on the back, but because the magnitude of the problem. So,
indeed, and thank you, Ms. Perry. I think the larger takeaway from that is, statistics don't necessarily tell you the entire story. And, there may be some more for us to dig into to understand a little bit more about how, with the success of some of your services, why you're, in your perspective, why the decreases are not steeper. And the only reason I'm short-circuiting this conversation is because we do have other guests today, and I'm sensing that we're going to have the need for another conversation, maybe with Ms. Barnett and Ms. Young, Mr. Barnett and Ms. Young, because I think there are a number of areas for us to discuss some of the recommendations that have been presented. And as this region came together prior to really prioritize reducing veterans' homelessness, maybe it's time for us again to consider some clear priorities that we have for moving the dial in the years ahead. So I'm sorry to short circuit you, Ms. Perry.
yes, the raw number would be helpful. Just
right.
The raw data, the number of people rehoused.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to conclude this item, and I'm sorry, Ms. Newton, we'll be sure to save your comment for the next conversation. Okay, we're going to move next to item number 11, where we're joined by WMATA's Vice President of Real Estate and Parking, Liz Price, who is here to brief us on WMATA's 10-year strategic plan for joint development that outlines the strategy that the transit agency has for accelerating development on Metro-owned property. This effort really speaks to our entire United planning framework, but specifically, WMATA has put some emphasis on our equity emphasis areas, so we're excited to hear from Ms. Price and have conversation after her presentation. Welcome.
Oh, there we go. Good morning or good afternoon. And this placement of the screen is just in the not sweet spot of my contact, so I'm hoping I can read from that far away as I get to the smaller bullets. I know we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to present my slides, but I'll breeze through some things that I think maybe are not as important to this group and focus in hopefully on the things that are most relevant, and then hopefully leave time for questions. So again, Liz Price, Vice President of Real Estate and Parking for Metro. My office oversees over 1,000 acres of property that Metro owns in and around our stations throughout the system. We're going to focus today on our joint development program that is managed out of my office. Joint development is an FTA term for real estate development on transit-owned property that involves not only private development, but also the development of public transit facilities. So it's truly a public-private partnership. So last month, Metro released our first strategic plan for joint development. This is the first we've done in the history of Metro, with the goal of accelerating joint development, aligning Metro and jurisdictional interest, attracting private sector investment to our properties, as well as prioritizing future development opportunities within our portfolio. We set an ambitious goal of completing 20 new joint development agreements in 10 years. If you've been around for a while, you know that's a faster pace than we've had in the past, so the plan looks at strategies for accelerating our work. I'm going to breeze through these because I think this group understands the value of transit-oriented development very well. I'll simply highlight here on this screen the Noma neighborhood, which is a really quintessential example of what TOD means to our region and the importance of it. An industrial area before Metro opened in 2005, largely undeveloped, mostly parking lots. 21 million square feet has been built or planned in just 16 years. It has generated for the district nearly $170 million in annual new tax revenue from that neighborhood alone, and generated 20,000 daily trips on Metro pre-COVID. TOD is also important to Metro in terms of driving sustainable and resilient ridership. This chart shows you the ridership growth in TOD neighborhoods pre-COVID. So even at a time when we were losing overall riders to the system, TOD neighborhoods were growing in terms of ridership. We don't have it on the slide here, but in the post-pandemic or during the pandemic and the recovery, we see this trend continuing where TOD neighborhoods are rebounding faster. TOD supports all of the goals that you all are instrumental in pushing on behalf of the region, reducing congestion, improving climate, addressing affordability. When we build residential in or accessible to Metro, we increase affordability by allowing families to live proximate to transit and reducing the cost of auto and car ownership. TOD also increases our economic competitiveness as a region. I'm not sure if you can read this slide. I hope I can. One of the things that we found maybe surprising when we looked at the analysis for the strategic plan was what has happened to development in and around Metro since COVID. And so on the left there you see, or pre-COVID, both for multifamily and office, Metro locations were about 2/3 of development starts, both in 2019. In 2021, we see Metro still at about 65% of multifamily starts, but nearly 100% of office starts. And so obviously our office market's having a tough time in the region as well as nationally, but where its development is happening, it's prioritizing Metro. So WMATA is a national leader in joint development. Over the last 40 years, we have delivered 55 buildings at 30 stations around the region. You can see on all of the stations there noted with black dots on the right. It amounts to about 17 million square feet of development. Importantly, it has generated nearly $200 million in new annual tax revenue for local and state governments. It's also meant increased ridership for Metro, which accounts for additional fares as well as real estate revenue. The impact of our program is around us all the time. You may not be aware that Metro was instrumental in developing many of the neighborhoods that you know well in your own communities, from Bethesda to the Navy Yard, Rhode Island Avenue, Ballston, throughout the region. But the plan really wants to focus on what's left and the opportunities we have still within the system. So there's 31 million square feet of additional development potential within our system. That could amount to what we estimate as 26,000 housing units, which we know are critical to the region. It would generate nearly $340 million in additional new annual local and state taxes. It also has important impacts for Metro with generating new riders, as well as fares and real estate revenue, which are important to Metro, particularly at this time as we're looking at fiscal sustainability. Our future opportunities are also concentrated in the eastern half of the region, thanks to COG for their work on the equity emphasis areas. We've mapped our future development stations against the equity emphasis areas that you all have identified, and 70% of our future development opportunities are in or adjacent to equity emphasis areas. So again, an opportunity to bring more investment, more amenities, more housing, and more services to neighborhoods that have not received as much investment in the past. So how are we going to do this? We need to accelerate we want to accelerate the pace of our work in order to bring those benefits to the region faster. In order to do that, we need to partner with all of you, our local jurisdictions, right-size our own transit facilities, which can make space for new development, increase the development readiness of our stations, and minimize implementation risks to ensure greater success of our projects. I'll focus on the first two a little bit more for this group in particular. Partnership is critical for all of these. We're active in all parts of the region. And the first one is, we really need to work with our local jurisdictions on coordinating site infrastructure and funding. Our projects bring extraordinary cost. They're not greenfields. They're usually already developed with parking or bus facilities that have to be relocated or rethought in order to make way for new development. And so that's expensive. It's a cost that most projects don't have to bear. And so we really need to work with all of you to figure out ways, creative ways and tools to fund some of that early infrastructure in order to attract private investment. We also have an opportunity to leverage local economic development strategies with our projects. We control some of the largest sites that still remain that are Metro accessible. They're real assets to the region that can be used to help attract new anchors, new companies, new institutions to our region. And so we should be thinking collectively about how to utilize those sites in your own economic development approaches. And then finally, supporting local housing goals. We know that's so important to the region as well as to Metro. Metro's policy on housing is that we will abide by the local affordable housing requirements for the jurisdiction in which our projects sit. And we're in many different ones, and so they're different in many different projects. That said, we are not able to subsidize affordable housing on our projects without additional support. All of the revenue from our projects goes back into the Transit Authority to support operations, which is so critical to the region as well as to certainly to lower income residents as well. So we're looking for opportunities to partner with jurisdictions, with companies, with philanthropic groups to expand affordable housing options at Metro, but with collaboration. Two examples of how we've done that locally recently. I think you're all aware of the Amazon Housing Equity Fund. They've committed $125 million to support and expand affordable housing at Metro sites. We've announced the first two projects already this year, which will fund over 700 units in Prince George's County at New Carrollton and at College Park. And in addition, I want to highlight Montgomery County also has enacted a very creative strategy in order to accelerate and increase housing production at metro sites with a local tax abatement, which helps fund the cost differential between high-rise construction and mid-rise construction. So we're able to get more units at metro sites, which also means more affordability because it's 20% of a bigger number. So that's been a very effective strategy, and we encourage, we'd love to talk to all of you about ways we might work together to further affordable units at Metro. The second action really focuses on what Metro can do to support and expand joint development. We have the opportunity to right-size our own facilities. They're taking up much of the space of the properties today. And so looking at what our parking demand is going to be, looking at pickup and drop-off needs and locations and design, and really optimizing all of our footprint in order to create more space for private development. Our sites are tax exempt, as I'm sure you know, until we engage in joint development. So we're really trying to be efficient and simplify our footprint in order to create more opportunities both for economic development, but also tax revenue generation for the local governments. I'm going to breeze through here, but there's certainly opportunities for us to increase the development readiness of our sites, and so that we can bring them to market faster and also get more interest from more qualified developers and get better outcomes. Same case on minimizing implementation risks. We have a number of examples in the past of projects that have gone to market but never been constructed. So we want to do some upfront work to really understand our sites, minimize the risk as we put them out to market, and accelerate the delivery of the actual benefits. And then finally, the strategic plan looks at the balance of our portfolio and evaluates the opportunities and prioritizes where we're going to start next. It looks at three components: the development potential of the site, so the zoning, the size of the site, the location, the infrastructure needs, how expensive are they, what are they, do we have a source of funding to support that, and then the market readiness. What are the rents, what are the absorption rates, vacancy rates, what can the neighborhood support in terms of new development. This will be very hard to read, I think, but hopefully you all have a copy of this, and there's many ways this is discussed in the plan itself, so you can dig into it for each of your regions. But we essentially prioritized into four areas. The first group in orange are existing agreements. We have about 10 stations where we have existing developers and plans in place, and so those projects are moving forward with entitlements, financing, closing, and construction. So you'll see activity happening in your communities at those projects in the very near future. The stations highlighted in green, there are 20 stations there. That's where we're focused on our next solicitations over the next 10 years. And so we'll be working closely with your planning directors and economic development directors, DOTs, and others to really solve for all of the challenges and open issues in order to bring those forward for private development. And group 4 represents future opportunities that may need more time and more planning efforts before we bring them forward for solicitations. In terms of next steps, we just released the plan. We're out talking to all of the jurisdictions. We've met with many of yours, and if we haven't, we have those scheduled in the next few weeks. We're meeting with the private sector and TOD advocates to, again, to raise the visibility of the opportunities that are out there and are coming. We'll be reporting annually on our progress. And the other thing I should mention about the last slide is that the prioritization is our assessment today. Obviously, things change, markets change, infrastructure needs become clearer, funds become available, sometimes funds go away. So this is a prioritization list that is not static. We will look at it on an annual basis, and things may move up. So there may be something that is in the planning category that may land an anchor tenant, and so that's going to move it up. So I just want to make that clear. This is something we'll be evaluating with your support and with the support of your teams to make sure that we're really focused on those that are projects that are really feasible in the next 10 years. So with that, I will stop. and take any questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Price. We really appreciate that, and for providing a real-time example of how agencies and our jurisdictions can utilize resources within our planning framework to accomplish broad goals. I have every confidence that Ms. Price will be concise with her responses, as she has just demonstrated. Let's reciprocate by being concise with our questions. So anybody, Vice Chair Stewart.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Price, for this. I'm over here. Sorry. Hi. For this presentation and the work you're doing. It's very exciting to have that. I know you talk broadly about partnerships and what we can do in local jurisdictions, but are there specific things that, as regional leaders, we can take away from your presentation today and bring back to our jurisdictions on how we can help partner and move some of these areas forward?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think there are many ways, and I think the most fundamental way is really working with us proactively to identify the infrastructure needs for the sites in your jurisdiction and identifying resources available to support that, whether it's capital funding, whether it's tax abatements. Every jurisdiction is different, so we have to kind of have more localized conversations about the right tools for those locations. But I think from our perspective, we can move much faster at Metro. We can bring these projects forward much quicker and deliver the benefits to the jurisdictions more quickly if we can have sort of region-wide or jurisdiction-wide conversations, similar to in Montgomery County, where they have identified a tax abatement for all Metro projects. So we know that that's in place. The developers know that's in place. It's a tool that is kind of transparent versus each project coming forward and having a conversation and a negotiation. That takes more time. And so I think where we can identify priorities for capital funding for infrastructure or other tools that can be targeted to these projects, we're able to bring those projects forward faster and deliver the tax revenue that they produce also more quickly. So we'd love to have follow-up conversations with each of your teams and plan to about what the needs are and what the tools are, and that's really the first step for us.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? Vice Chair Allen.
Hello, Ms. Price. Good to see you. I'll try to be concise. Could you, a lot of this conversation seems to be focused on a lot of our rail spaces. You mentioned buses though earlier, and so just want to give you, if you could just kind of expand if you can, or perhaps this for a different conversation, as we think about the bus transformation plan that WMATA has been going through, and as we think about both our rider retention on bus as well as hopefully our rider recovery, not just on rail, but on bus as well. Any thoughts that you think we have on our mind as we think about how the bus transformation plan feeds into those types of 10-year strategic plan and how we look at the ridership and the growth of our bus routes?
Yeah, thank you for that question. A great opportunity to clarify. So the reason I focus on rail in this conversation is that is where our real estate assets are. Oftentimes it's dovetailed with bus stops, but they're anchored by stations. Obviously the bus network goes much further and much broader. So I think there's certainly great opportunities, on a macro level to improve ridership and to gain riders by improving the bus system. I think we all saw in the pandemic how important that was to the region and maintaining it, and there are other departments at Metro that are looking at the bus transformation project to really optimize our routes and service for those patrons. I think in terms of the real estate, the other opportunity we have in developing it is to always be thinking about how to improve accessibility to our stations, both from bus, so that we can get more people into the stations and using it. If it's convenient and easy and safe, people will use the transit assets there, but also from walkability and bikeability perspective as well. So I think there's an access issue that is the nexus with our real estate program, and I think also because our real estate is the most immediate to the station itself, we have a really important role in defining the environment. If we build things that are sort of car-centric or a low density, it creates a certain environment. But if we create a really high-quality public environment, public space, streets, sidewalks, parks, and the like, that encourages future development beyond our borders, which we don't always control. We don't control. You all control. It encourages them to also deliver in that vein. So I think we can kind of set the table in a way that encourages, better outcomes for accessibility.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions from those joining us remotely? Ms. Partman, did you get any indication from anyone? All right, great. I'll take prerogative and ask the final question for this, Ms. Price. So, you know, I realize that WMATA is not trying to supersede local planning principles or plans. However, there is also the desire to extract maximum value from these projects, not only for WMATA, but for any other community benefits. So just give us a sense to what extent you engage in conversations about, you know, providing bonus density, for example, or even encouraging jurisdictions to look beyond what they may have planned due to advances in construction techniques. Like mid-rise used to, you know, sort of top off at, you know, 5 stories, but now, you know, people are building stick built up to 7 stories. So to what extent do you encourage or participate in conversations about trying to create as much value as possible so that more can accrue to WMATA and more could also accrue for community benefits as well?
Yeah, great question, and you were absolutely right at the beginning, which is we don't control the zoning, we don't control entitlements. We're part of a larger, obviously, ecosystem that you all are very much at the center of. But that being said, you know, we are a participant in those processes. I mean, most recently in the district, with the revisions to the comp plan, we were very engaged. My predecessor, I should say, because I wasn't here then, was very engaged in those conversations. Again, making the case for maximizing height and density where we have transit infrastructure. And so we're always going to be a voice for that. And ultimately, it's your decision and your community's decisions. But if we look at in the plan, I don't have a slide for this, but in the plan, there's a table that shows, you know, FTA encourages, you know, FAR density at a certain level at transit. If you look at our stations, we are woefully below that in almost all cases. Now, there's a lot of work happening around the region to correct that and to address that and bring more opportunities to transit to encourage that, but there's a lot of opportunities still available. So we are certainly, you know, a voice for that, and working hard to hopefully, again, this is important for the future of Metro, for the future of transit, to again reinforce the investments we've all made in the system to bring more riders and more jobs and more opportunities to those stations.
Thank you so very much, and we really appreciate your joining us today. They're extensive. Ms. Price's entire slide deck, along with supplementary materials, was made available in your packet. I highly encourage you to pour through it all. It's fascinating, and the opportunities are terrific, so thank you for joining us today. I will note, Ms. Pandek, in case you missed him, Mr. Mendelson has joined us from the district. You got it? Excellent. Now we'll move to our last item today, where we're going to be joined by several COG planners, including John Sherman, Transportation Planner, Senior Environmental Planner Leah Boggs, and Senior Principal Health Planner Jennifer Sheeter, who are going to brief us on some other ways in which equity emphasis areas can be used to advance various programs and projects across the region. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Bean, who I guess will in turn frame this up and then start off our dream team of talent to discuss with us today.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the board's work and focus on equity emphasis areas, and this has come together because of the muscle of our transportation analysis through the environmental justice look, through our work with the chief health officers and social determinants of health, and our association with GARE, Government Alliance for Race and Equity. So I'd like to start off with a focus on application equity emphasis areas as it pertains to roadway safety, and John Sherman.
All right. Thank you, Chuck, Chair Dorsey, and members of the board. Well, this is just a quick slide. I think you've all seen the equity emphasis area geography that that you guys have approved and the TPB recently, but let me just go into the roadway safety aspects. In 2019, the Transportation Planning Board commissioned a regional roadway safety study. This was in response to the unacceptably high number of roadway fatalities in the region. The study was intended to do several things, including understanding the factors contributing to fatal and serious injury crashes in the region, and identifying and recommending proven effective policy, programmatic, and project solutions. The results of the study, including recommendations, were rolled out to the TPB from April through June 2020. In July of 2020, the TPB adopted a resolution based on the study recommendations that articulated a regional safety policy and also established and funded a regional roadway safety program. This program is intended to help TPB member jurisdictions conduct safety studies as well as plan and design projects to reduce roadway fatalities and serious injuries. During that same meeting, the TPB also adopted a resolution that establishes equity as a fundamental value and integral part of all TPB work activities. At this point, the safety study was close to wrapping up, but based on the very clear direction of the board that the board laid out on the topic of equity, staff allocated additional funds to the safety study to conduct a separate analysis of the crash data, this time focusing on equity. That analysis was completed in May of last year, so what did we find? The basic gist of the analysis was to compare roadway safety outcomes within our region's equity emphasis areas to the same outcomes in the rest of the region, that is, everywhere that is not in an equity emphasis area. I will share two charts from that analysis. This chart shows the average annual number of fatalities per 100,000 residents that occurred within equity emphasis areas, as represented by the orange bars, and the same numbers that occurred outside of equity emphasis areas, represented by the purple bars. Here, we clearly see that the number of roadway fatalities per capita is significantly higher within equity emphasis areas than they are in the rest of the region. The bar on the left shows the rate for the U.S. as a whole as a point of reference. But what about the fatal crashes themselves? Are there any differences between the types of fatal crashes within equity emphasis areas as compared to those outside of equity emphasis areas? This chart shows the percentage of fatalities by contributing factor for both equity emphasis areas and non-equity emphasis areas. Note that there is almost always more than one contributing factor for any given crash, so these figures will not add up to 100%. So, for example, on the top line, we can see that 34% of fatal crashes within equity emphasis areas occur at or near intersections, while 31% of fatal crashes outside of equity emphasis areas occur at or near intersections. What stands out in this chart is that fatal crashes within equity emphasis areas are significantly more likely to involve pedestrians and young drivers than fatal crashes in the rest of the region, as you can see in the second and third set of bars from the top. Conversely, fatal crashes outside of equity emphasis areas are more likely to involve unbelted vehicle occupants, speeding, older drivers, distracted drivers, and roadway departures. One way we are using the findings from this study is in the project selection process for the Regional Roadway Safety Program. Applications for projects that are within or connect to equity emphasis areas receive extra points in the scoring. In the first two rounds of this program, 7 of the 10 winning proposals were for projects located within or immediately adjacent to equity emphasis areas. Also, as part of our ongoing efforts to update our regional roadway safety analysis as new crash data become available, we will continue to break down and report on crash outcomes for our equity emphasis areas. This concludes my remarks, and I guess we'll take questions after all of us are done.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. I think each of these three presentations really merits about a 30-minute presentation, but my idea here was let's try to see what we can do with about 4 minutes to just get the idea that there's many different kinds of applications. So with that as context, Leah Boggs.
Thank you, Chair Dorsey and board members. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today our regional about our regional climate and energy equity planning initiatives and how we are leveraging equity emphasis areas on our work. Back in 2020, you here on the COG Board adopted goals in which creating resilient communities is a core part of our region's climate goals. For the 2030 Climate and Energy Action Plan, we conducted a climate risk and vulnerability assessment. This is the main example we wanted to share with you today on how equity emphasis areas were leveraged to identify potentially climate vulnerable communities in our region. In addition, we are working to follow up on the climate priorities you all here on the board discussed back in March. So we wanted to briefly mention to you, we are also planning to leverage equity emphasis areas in our EV assessment work. In the next couple slides, I will highlight the equity emphasis areas and climate mapping we did for the 2030 Climate and Energy Action Plan. And for further reference, I will just say 2030 plan. The Metropolitan Washington region is already experiencing the impacts of a changing climate. One of the maps we looked at was one of energy burden, or the percentage of household incomes that go towards energy costs overlaid with the energy equity emphasis areas. What staff found by doing the mapping exercise is that across the region, residents in equity emphasis areas spend larger portion of income on home energy costs than other residents. This figure here shows that median energy burden in equity emphasis areas is 6.6% higher than other census tracts in the region. We also looked at extreme heat in equity emphasis areas. Here, heat is the #1 cause of weather-related injuries and fatalities in the region. What we found is that equity emphasis areas are slightly more heavily burdened by extreme heat. The median number of extreme heat days a year that people experience in the region is 8.61 days. However, the median in equity emphasis areas is 8.75 days. Potentially vulnerable populations may face greater challenges from extreme heat. For example, they may have more challenges of accessing air conditioning. We've all heard those stories before. If there are power outages during extreme heat, there may be challenges to populations that rely on electronic medical devices as well as refrigerated medications. Also, populations that reside in urban areas are more at risk due to urban heat island effects. We also learned at equity emphasis areas and flooding, what we found was FEMA's 100-year floodplains run through more than 60% of equity emphasis areas, where approximately 1 million people reside. Also notable is that more than half of the region's equity emphasis areas are within the Anacostia watershed, where significant flooding occurs. Persons in flood areas are at risk for loss of property and injuries. Low-income households, unemployed persons, people with language barriers, and the elderly are more likely to have limited resources or face other challenges that may hinder their ability to prepare for flooding and evacuate before and during an event. In conclusion, climate change will impact people and communities differently. Increased extreme heat and increased frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation events are likely to increase and further impact vulnerable communities. Equity is woven throughout all the actions in the 2030 Action Plan. It was very important for us to do this because creating resilient communities is only possible when the needs of our most vulnerable are met. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Boggs.
And third will be Jenny Sheeter with a public health perspective.
Thank you. I realize last item, last presentation, and a very dense agenda. So for those who don't know me, I'm Jenny Sheeter. I'm the Principal Health Planner here at COG. And I'll be sharing with you the Uneven Opportunities Report and how that correlates with the findings of the Equity Emphasis Area. So I'll be going over why we did this report in the first place, what we found, and what we're doing with the data. So why do we do the Uneven Opportunities Report in the first place? It's actually because of Region Forward. Health is one of the 9 domains within Region Forward. With the Region Forward health goal is to seek communities in which every person enjoys health and well-being. Well, how do we measure health? I mean, how do we measure it in a meaningful way at the community level? Health is a very complex measure. You've all heard of the social determinants of health. There's a lot of things that determine our health, and actually, a lot of those things are part of the other Region Forward domains like housing and transportation and a lot of the things we heard about today as well. So the Health Officials Committee was fortunate to get a lot of foundation support around the region and commissioned the VCU Center on Society and Health to do a report to look at life expectancy and the factors that shape our health. So what did we find? It would be no surprise to the board that we confirmed geographic disparities around the region and also within each jurisdiction. We call that in the health world of islands of disadvantage. So with life expectancy, that is going to be your map on the left. And important to note, when I say life expectancy, that is the average number of years that a newborn can be expected to live in a given area based on prior mortality patterns in a specific area. When this report was being developed between 2015 and 2018, I had 2 newborns. And it bothered me that a newborn would have a different varying predicted amount of life based on zip code. On the right, you see the Healthy Places Index, which essentially is a composite index of the 48 indicators across all those domains. And again, these islands of disadvantage correlate with the equity emphasis areas. So what influences our health? Well, largely education, those economic and household resources, followed by housing and transportation. However, if race, ethnicity, and immigrant status was a separate domain, it would count for nearly half of the variation of health across census tracts. And that's why racial equity matters. And finally, what was done with the data? So here, the Northern Virginia Health Foundation funded an interactive map tool that has all this data, which includes the Healthy Places Index, the life expectancy, the various indicators. This is also funded by Healthcare Initiative Foundation in Montgomery County. But it was a tool for funders, for health officials to view these islands of disadvantage and have a better plan to put the strategies, the community engagement, the interventions to move forward. So to put in place, as Chuck said earlier, I think in the meeting, the equity in all policies. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Chuck.
Thank you. Turn to the board for questions. Again, I did not ask staff to make long presentations about all these items, but to just give you a sense of the internal staff discussion about the board resolution for 2020, weaving equity throughout all that we do. This is the kind of discussions that we're having.
Outstanding. All right. Questions, comments from the room. Mr. Collins.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to let the board know that Mr. Bean will be doing essentially a primer for Charles County on how to actually institute, the findings and to put together what will perhaps be a future that focuses on the EEAs. And so I think where we've begun to receive information is focused primarily on health disparities. But I think being able to take it to that next phase where you're able to actually implement the information received, to actually put that in a context where it can actually be a part of how you actually fund for the future, that's really the goal for us. So,
Mr. Collins, thank you for that. And if you'll indulge a commentary from me, I'm just so pleased to see this thoughtful work by staff. I am, first of all, wondering how we ever thought we were really making progress on issues without tools like this being an extensive part of our work. It's really great to see how when we think about equity from an analytical framework, how much the opportunities come into focus of what we could and should be working on. And then furthermore, I'm just really proud of all of you and Mr. Collins talking about Charles County. Equity has become such a buzzword to the point where it may have lost some meaning and is often just the way that people start virtue signaling. I'm just glad to see that we're about substance. So I'll shut up, get off the soapbox, and recognize anyone else who wants to speak. Seeing no one else, Vice Chair Allen.
I don't want you to have the last word.
I have people virtually, so.
Well, I absolutely want to echo what you said, and the maps that we showed for health, we see the same map over and over and over again. Whether it's the District of Columbia, whether it's our region, we see the same map over and over and over again. And I will echo your comments, Mr. Chair, of just being really proud of this body trying to tackle this from so many different lenses, to all say that map's unacceptable, and to have the data. I mean, I remember when we were back in TPB, many, many years ago, helping create this equity emphasis area and debating what does that even mean, and then now seeing it many years later really baked into every aspect of what we do, pulling that data and helping that inform us as policymakers and decision makers, I think will lead us the right way. So I just really appreciate it. Thank you for the hard work. I know we don't have time to go through all of it in detail, but I want to lift up and echo your comments, Mr. Chairman, as well, about how important this is.
And you said it very well, too, Vice Chair Allen. Is there anyone on the WebEx who would like to comment? I see Ms. Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I concur with everything that's been said, and I just want to encourage us even further to be just intentional about the equity language and intentional about the equity action across the region. I know some areas are a lot more established and popular, if you will, in our region, but there is an opportunity for us to really dig deep in other areas, and this is a subliminal message, but I think there's an opportunity for us to dig even deeper regionally. And so thank you for, again, as Mr. Chairman has said, the action, but we have to be very, very intentional about changing the lens of equity.
Terrific. And it looks like that will very much suffice as the almost last word, but the last word will be a reminder that if you want to be inspired by this work and really figure out how to put it really into action in your jurisdiction, you're invited to come here on May 20th, a week from Friday, to join the Racial Equity Learning Series for elected officials. With that, we have concluded the business on our agenda. I am open to a motion to adjourn. It has been moved, and I heard chatter, which I'll take as a second, that we should adjourn. And I'll just say I look forward to seeing everybody virtually next time on, I believe it's June 8th. With that, thank you, everyone. We're adjourned.
Well done.